We're going to take an exciting topic, learning to fly, and make it dull through the miracle of regulations. All right, what is it actually like? You go out to, let's say, Hanscom Field, walk out in the ramp, and pre-flight the aircraft with an instructor. Make sure there's nothing obviously broken or hanging loose. You'll learn to recognize and control aircraft attitude, depending on whether the aircraft is pitched up or banked a little bit left or right, and how much power is applied. That pretty much determines what the aircraft is going to do. You'll learn how to take off and land, and now you know how to fly a working airplane or helicopter. This process will typically take 5 to 10 hours. In the old days, people would actually solo sometimes at 4 hours of flying experience. It's not going to be adequate for an FAA certificate, however, because, as I said earlier, what if you're the only pilot on board and the aircraft breaks or you get lost? So let's add another 40 hours for that. What's a good trainer airplane? You don't want it to be too light because it'll be unstable in any wind. You don't want it to be too heavy because if it has a lot of inertia, you'll have to think ahead. A power change in a heavy aircraft doesn't cause the aircraft to immediately rise or fall. You don't want it to be too fast. If the stall speed is high, you're going to have to keep flying fast and thinking fast, which is hard to do when you're new. All right, not too much power, because when you pull the power back or push it forward, that's a transition, for example, from 0 to 310 horsepower in a Cirrus SR-22. That's a little bit too much for a beginner to manage usually. You want an airplane that's reluctant to go into a spin. You heard about stalled wings in the last lecture from Tina. It's easy to recover from a stall and a spin in a good trainer aircraft, because if the pilot just lets go of the controls, the aircraft will usually go back to flying itself. So ideal examples of trainers, my favorite is the Diamond Star DA-40. I just wish it were a little quieter and not quite as hot inside on a sunny day. The venerable Cessna 172 and the Piper Warrior. They're all very docile and easy to fly. And they're 4-seaters, so they're a lot more stable than a 2-seater. An okay example is the Cirrus SR-20. That's just not quite as simple and forgiving as the above airplanes, although a lot of professional flight schools now use it. The marginal operating cost of one of these trainer airplanes is between $100 and $150 an hour. When you rent from a flight school, you have to pay the total cost, though, including the fixed costs, plus maybe a little bit of profit margin. So they'll rent for between $150 and $200 an hour with fuel. What about gliding? Could that be a better trainer airplane? Certainly people who fly gliders have great stick and rudder skills. You can join a club. It's a lot more investment of time because it takes a whole bunch of people to move gliders around on the field, hook them up to the tow planes. You might pay about $50 for a tow up to 3,000 feet, and somewhere between $0 and $50 an hour for the use of the glider. You can stay up all day if you're flying in the Sierra Mountains. You can also sink back down to the ground in about 15 minutes if you try it here in the flatlands, except in the middle of the summer maybe. You'll be soloing at age 14, and just think, you'll be Captain Sully-style hero in every landing, except you'll make it to a runway, one hopes. How about a good trainer helicopter? Same idea. You don't want a light 2-seater because they tend to be unstable. As I'll explain later, you're going to be practicing a lot of auto rotations where you roll the throttle to idle and glide in the helicopter. So you want something that has good rotor inertia, which makes auto rotations a lot easier. Rugged skids for practicing those hover auto rotations where you kill the engine and let the helicopter fall from about 3 feet above the ground. And a reasonable operating cost. If you're the U.S. government, you don't care if it costs $4,000 an hour to run a jet-powered helicopter for a beginner. But if you're paying with your Visa card, something like a Robinson R44 is a good choice. The marginal operating cost for these helicopters is about $225 to $250 per hour. That's because all the rotating components get replaced every 2,200 hours. The blades, the transmissions, whereas in an airplane, the wings don't need to be thrown out. So, the steps to getting an FAA pilot certificate. There's some pre-solo work, then you solo, then you start flying around so-called cross-country. That could be to New Hampshire or New Bedford, Massachusetts. You prepare for your check ride, get signed off by the instructor, and then you get your private pilot certificate. Takes about 55 hours for most people who take it seriously, but it's a minimum of, by regulation, of 40 hours of flight time. With your private pilot certificate, you can take a U.S. registered airplane and fly all the way around the world, as Matt's going to talk about at lunch. You can do pretty much anything except fly in the clouds and take money for flying. You will fly what you learned in. So if you have a rating for a hot air balloon, that's all that you'll fly until you get additional ratings. You can fly at night, unlike in Canada, which requires a separate rating for that. All right, let's talk about how we can make something that's fun and carefree and turn it into a world of boredom. That takes Congress and the FAA. Congress passes laws. They create and fund the FAA, and the FAA creates these regulations called the FARs. They're in Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, and then there are parts. So FAR 61, for example, is the section that relates to learning to fly. A lot of information about flying is public. Let's say somebody's bragging at a party. Just look them up in the Airman Registry. I don't know when there's going to be a hashtag campaign to get the FAA to change this sexist language, but for now, let's look up our hero, Matt Guthmiller. Ooh, Matthew Lee Guthmiller and Matthew Thomas Guthmiller. Wow, there's two of them. Minnesota, doesn't sound right. Aberdeen, South Dakota. Here he is, a commercial pilot, a remote pilot, and he has a ground instructor certificate. So 3 certificates. How about, well, maybe that's enough. Somebody shows you a picture of their Gulfstream, look up the tail number. Maybe you'll find out it's only NetJets. Just type the tail number into Google, and you'll get to either the FAA or FlightAware. All right, categories and classes. With respect to certification of airmen, a category is, for example, airplane, and a class is single-engine land. So, here's the category. Rotorcraft, for example, divides up into helicopter and gyroplane. Powered lift, that's always one of my favorite ones. I think that's something like an Osprey, that vertical takeoff and landing airplane. Class is, for example, multi-engined seaplane. That would be a class of airplane. Okay, so there are 5 different kinds of pilot certificates that you can get. Sport pilot is kind of the new one that was supposed to bring tens of thousands of additional people into aviation, and of course that failed. Recreational pilot was never popular. Private pilot is what we're talking about here. Commercial's the next step. You don't have to work for an airline to get a commercial. That's kind of the stepping stone before you get a flight instructor rating, for example. Airline transport pilot, that lets you sit in the left seat of a Boeing 737 for United Airlines. To these core certificates are added ratings. So, for example, you can have airplane single engine C and fly that new Icon A5 that you've been reading about, perhaps, or glider. There's nothing special about the single engine land rating. This is where most people start, and people think that, well, to fly helicopters, don't you have to start with flying little Cessnas and Pipers? No. If your mom has a multi-engine seaplane, you can get your primary training in the multi-engine seaplane, and that is what you will fly. If your dad has a hot air balloon, you can get your private pilot certificate in a hot air balloon and fly only hot air balloons. Flight instructor is a separate certificate. It has its own ratings. And the remote pilot certificate is also separate. I don't know what the other ratings are, but one of them is small unmanned aircraft system. Okay, to keep things very confusing for your test, they will ask you, I don't know why anybody would ever need to know this, but you do need to know it on the test. With respect to certification of aircraft, you have, for example, normal, which is not very strong, acrobatic, which is super strong in terms of the G-forces that it can handle, maybe, up to 9 Gs, utility, which is somewhere in the middle. The class, make a note to edit this slide. G tolerance 12. Okay, the class of aircraft, confusingly, is something like airplane. All right, so how is the mother of all bureaucracies structured? The FAA is part of the Department of Transportation, and the National Transportation Safety Board is off to the side there, established in 1967. Again, the structure of the regulations is the NTSB is there under Title 49. We'll learn a little bit about that. And the FARs are in Title 14, divided up into these parts. So FAR 61 is really Part 61 of Title 14. Okay, here's some fun knowledge that's not on the exam, but to be an air carrier, that's FAR 119. If it's charter, that's additionally FAR 135, or airline. You'll hear people talk about Part 121 operations. That's JetBlue. Aircraft certification is also under the FARs. So everything that keeps a small airplane safe is FAR 23. The rules around making a redundant and safe small helicopter, FAR 27. If you want to do crop dusting, FAR 137. Airports are also certified under the FARs, under 139. You'll hear about FAR 141 flight schools, where the FAA has approved a particular curriculum. Here's your certificate. Orville and Wilbur are on the back. The minimum standards are actually fairly sensible. Let's give some credit to the bureaucrats at the FAA. But a lot of the stuff that they've written down kind of makes sense. Okay. We'll talk about the key concepts. I'll just let you read that slide. Also, the instrument rating, you'll hear about this afternoon from Dave Boozer. Type ratings. If you're going to fly a turbojet or a heavy airplane or other designated aircraft, you're going to need a specific type rating on your certificate to fly that aircraft. You need endorsements from instructors if you're going to fly things like a high-performance airplane, more than 200 horsepower, complex airplane, or a tailwheel airplane. FAR 61.3 tells you what you need to have in your possession when you go flying around. So, for example, your pilot certificate, your medical. There's some regulations around basic med that I personally don't understand because I've never used them. But in that case, you won't have to fly with your medical certificate. A photo ID, such as a state driver's license or a passport. The authorities of various types can demand to see them, but they can't take them away. Drugs and alcohol are bad. Let's prove it. This had better load a lot faster once this computer is finished beating itself to death with Dropbox.
Now, as I was saying, drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs. If you do them, you're bad because drugs are bad, okay? It's a bad thing to do drugs, so don't be bad. Bad.
All right. I hope I've convinced you. Certainly the FAA.
Now, as I was saying, drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs. If you do them, you're bad because drugs are bad, okay? It's a bad thing to do drugs, so don't be bad.
Well, good example. From current slide. Oh no. Wow. Stiff penalty for incompetence. Okay, certificate duration. Oh yeah, you have to tell the FAA if you get busted for driving under the influence. And actually, a friend of a friend of mine got tangled up with this. A young, fresh out of college guy, or maybe he was still in college, and it was really tough. He really wasn't an alcoholic, but the FAA treated him like an alcoholic, and they just refused to believe that he could be treated. So I don't know. Take an Uber. All right, certificate duration. The student pilot certificate will expire, and then the medical expires. We'll talk about that later. Other pilot certificates actually don't expire. Once a pilot, always a pilot. Medical certificates are valid for 60 calendar months if you're under 40, or 24 months if you're over 40. You need a third class certificate for being a flight instructor or flying yourself, your friends, and your family all the way around the world. Left seat in an airline is first class medical. Right seat in the airline is second class. And all these are kind of designed with different probabilities of dropping dead in the cockpit. So the FAA really wants to minimize, for example, with an EKG, that the captain of the airliner will not collapse in flight. All right. Knowledge test, you need an endorsement. You're going to get one after this course to take a knowledge test or a practical test. I didn't know about this far until I started teaching this class. If you cheat, you're barred for a year. Generally speaking, you will not be able to fail a test completely. You might fail one maneuver. If you just persistently do it wrong, the examiner, usually will give you one or two chances, or at least a couple chances. You have to be consistently outside of the standards in order to fail. But anyway, if you do fail, it's often just one little thing, and you have to go and get retraining, a new sign-off, and up you go again, maybe on a 15-minute check ride just to demonstrate turns around a point or whatever it was that you failed. Okay, you are only required to log flight time for meeting a practical test requirement or establishing currency that you are legal to fly because, for example, you did 3 takeoffs and landings within the last 90 days. Most people log all their time. You're responsible for figuring out whether or not you have the flu. you will every 2 years do an hour of ground and an hour of flight with an instructor. That's at a minimum. Or you will possibly get an instrument rating, for example, or a helicopter rating. This is really the bare minimum. Insurance companies often are more stringent than the FAA, and they would require you, for example, to do a flight review once a year. And I would say for most people in New England, since we tend to slack off a bit during the wintertime, it's a good idea to go up with an instructor every spring before you start taking your friends out to the beach and to the mountains. All right. Within the preceding 90 days, you have to have done 3 takeoffs and landings. And if you're going to carry them at night, which of course has to be defined, and that's for the landing purposes, 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise, you have to have done 3 takeoffs and landings to a full stop at night. And it has to be in the category, class, and type, if applicable. So if you're not flying jets, just ignore the type. But category and class means if it's a multi-engine land airplane, it has to be the night or day landings have to be done in that particular type. If it's helicopters, landing a helicopter doesn't make you current in the airplane. Although the flight review does. You can do your flight review in a helicopter, and now you're legal to fly the airplane. Maybe that's not wise. Maybe that's not insurable, but it is legal. You have to tell the FAA if you move within 30 days. That will be on the test, or it may be on the test. All right. Solo. To solo, the instructor has to give you a written test. You must receive training on specified maneuvers. You get signed off to fly solo, and you have certain limitations. The CFI, for example, will say no more than 10 knots of wind. The FAA puts in limitations like, you can't fly in the clouds, you can't fly over the clouds, you can't take passengers on your solo flight. All right. For each cross-country solo, if you're going beyond the local area of the airport, then you need a CFI to review your flight plan and sign off for that solo flight. Can you fly solo right next to an Airbus A320 or a Boeing 747? Absolutely. They're usually found in Class B airspace, for example, the airspace around Logan Airport. You're going to need training in that airspace and a sign-off from a flight instructor. What if you want to land at Logan Airport? Well, you can't do that because of FAR 91 Appendix B, which takes Logan off the list, but you can land at Salt Lake City, which is a Class B airport, and that's a good thing because there's a flight school there, and that's probably where you took off. All right. How about to be a private pilot? You got to be 17 years old, so you can solo at 16, but you have to be 17 to actually earn your certificate. So a huge number of young people will solo on their 16th birthday and get their private pilot check ride done on their 17th birthday. You have to pass the knowledge test, and you need your CFI sign off for the practical test, as we discussed. Okay. Flight proficiency. The regulations say what you need to be able to do, and there's a lot more detail in these airman certification standards that are published. You need 40 hours minimum of experience. 20 of that has to be dual instruction with a CFI in the right seat. If it's an airplane, CFI will be in the left seat if it's a helicopter. 10 hours of solo, and the remaining 10 hours minimum could be solo or dual. Most people only do their minimum of 10 hours of solo, and all the rest of their training is dual. The training has some requirements, like some of it has to be at night, some of it has to be instrument training so that you can at least make a 180-degree turn out of a cloud safely if you get into one inadvertently. 3 hours of it has to be within 2 calendar months of the test. Oh, cross country. We keep using this term. That means just going to an airport that's at least 50 nautical miles away from where you started. All right. Your solo, 5 hours of that has to be so-called cross country. And one of it has to be 150 nautical miles total, with one leg of at least 50 nautical miles. This won't be an issue around here. Almost all of our local airports have controlled towers, but most airports nationwide don't. So the feds put in this requirement to do 3 takeoffs and landings at an airport with a tower. You will be not flying for money. However, let's say you take 4 friends. All of you can split. You can split the expenses 4 ways, like what you paid to rent the airplane from a flight school or flying club, what you paid in landing fees and for fuel. I think there are some exceptions for charity flights. Look at that regulation carefully. So what did you learn today? The FAA essentially is run like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts. There's a merit badge system, all kinds of stuff you can earn. It's kind of motivational. You get your private and then you think, I want all these other ratings and certificates as well. Everything except for the drones hangs off either the pilot or the CFI certificate. Minimums are 20, 10, and 10. You can stay current in the eyes of the FAA, but maybe not the insurance company, by flying every quarter and flying with an instructor every 2 years. Questions?